So, like about a week ago, at least that's when I saw it, Snappy Dragon released a video in which she talked about um, medieval witches, or more accurately, the modern witch aesthetic and how some of it is deeply anti-Semitic. And in that video, she mentioned a little something called the medieval Christian belief in Jewish cis male menstruation. And I went, gosh dang it, I was going to do a video on that. Because I wrote a paper about that in college. And I feel like it was something that is absolutely appropriate for this channel. Like, just very on brand for me. Is it historical? Yes. Is it really weird? Yes. Can I somehow massage it into something that is appropriate for writers? Yeah. So anyway, first I'm going to talk a tiny bit about my paper, because what actually happened was I was in a sociology of religion college course, undergraduate, and fun fact, my minor is sociology. And I wanted to do my paper about the place of women in medieval Jewish life. And then I kept coming across references in various articles that I was reading to this Christian belief that Jewish men menstruated. Cis men menstruated. Because, like, it would not be that odd if trans men menstruated. So, you know, I kept coming across this reference, and I went, well, that's bonkers. That's what my paper is going to be about now, because it has to be. I can't just not do my paper about this now. And if that isn't the best description of what researching in college for papers is like, I don't know what is. But anyway, I wrote my paper, and I was actually a little bit early with it, and my professor said, I hope you all remember that you guys were supposed to do a presentation. And I'm like, what presentation? And he's like, oh, crap, I forgot to tell you, you guys are doing presentations. Now, at this point, I was the only person in this class who had decided that I did not want to do a group project. I was also the only Jew in the class, and it was in Alabama, rural Alabama. So I was, this is why I went, I think I'll do my project on my own. Thank you very much. I think I can handle it. And my professor agreed, so off I went. But now he's going, I forgot to tell you guys, there's a group presentation part of this. And every other kid in the class is going, yeah, I'm going to scramble and I'm going to get this PowerPoint done and our group's going to be fine. And I'm like, oh, please, dear God, do not make me explain the concept of Christians believing that Jewish cis men menstruated during the Middle Ages and early modern period to a class full of rural Alabama Gentiles who are all either Christian or the kind of atheists who were absolutely raised by Christians. Sitting here like, please, please don't make me do that. So I showed my work to my professor, and he looked at it, and he looked at me and said, please don't present this to the class. This is definitely a decent paper. I'll give it an A. Please don't ever, ever talk about this in front of the class. I'm like, oh, thank God. So instead of presenting it to the class, I am going to talk about Jewish cis male menstruation and the myth thereof here on a YouTube video for the entire internet. Well, funny how life works out. So, I mentioned, medieval, this as a medieval myth, but it was a myth that definitely lasted well into the early modern period. We have attestations of it, at least as late in like well-respected scholastic literature, until the 1600s. So deep in the 17th century, we had references to the idea that Jewish cis men, menstruated. And we have the beginnings of this idea dating as far back as the 11th century. So that's a pretty broad range of time. I can tell you that the full-blown idea that Jewish men menstruated was not really, it was medieval. There were certainly aspects of it that were medieval, but it became more common in the early modern period. And so I want to talk a little bit about how that ties in to other ideas about Jewish identity and Jewish ethnicity and air quotes here, racial difference. The idea of racial difference as a broad category that doesn't just include Jews, and the idea of women's bodies as somehow cursed, and unfortunately Jewish views on misogyny as well. I have no idea what Pippa has decided to bark to. I'm very sorry. So the idea that Jewish men menstruated first really began to rise as an idea, as a potential reason that Jewish men might have, or Jewish people might have, to want to kill Christian children. There is this idea that, of course, that there was the whole idea of the blood libel, that Christians killed, that Jewish people killed Christian children to make use of their blood and flesh, or just blood and or flesh, in some manner, to, basically to cure some sort of affliction or to give them some sort of powers. There's also the idea that this murder was ritual, and there's a lot there, and I will talk about that in another video. But there's, what is the explanation for Jewish people doing this terrible, terrible thing? Of course, the actual explanation is that it didn't happen. It wasn't happening. But the explanation that Christians came up with, well, there were many explanations, but one of the explanations that Christians came up with is the idea that Jews, or a subset of Jews, because sometimes it was a subset, were cursed through our responsibility for killing Jesus. The charge of deicide. That Jews were responsible for killing Jesus. Somehow the Romans and Pontius Pilate were not involved. And that they took this sin upon themselves willingly, in the whole, let his blood be upon us and on our children and their children. So either all Jews were responsible and all Jews, suffered some kind of curse from this, or at the very least a subset of Jews who had actually been there at the day. And those Jews were cursed to menstruate. And the blood of the Christian child was used to try to alleviate the sufferings associated with menstruation. So where does this idea that Jewish men menstruate even come from? Where the hell do they get this? Because what? What? Really? Well, it comes from the notion that women were cursed because, as the daughters of Eve, we have in some ways inherited the fact that she was the first to take a bite out of the apple in the Garden of Eden. And having taken this bite out of the apple in the Garden of Eden, women are afflicted with menstruation, menstrual pain, and the pain associated with pregnancy, labor, and childbirth. So the idea is that Jewish men took upon themselves the guilt for the blood of Christ. The blood is on them. And, Jews, men and women, took this. And because Jewish men had taken this, they were cursed, like women were cursed because of Eve. And so, like Christian women and Jewish women, they menstruated. Now, I thought to myself, originally when reading this, do they believe, did medieval Christians actually, remember that Jewish women existed? Or did they believe that we, double menstruated? Or what was going on there? And indeed, there was actually the belief that Jewish women had much more painful childbirth than Christian women. That because Jewish women had a double dose of God's curse, they had the curse of Eve and the curse of taking Jesus' blood upon their hands, they had horrible childbirth. And this was also one of the things that supposedly the blood of the Christian child was used to alleviate, was the unusually agonizing childbirth pains. So, props to them. They believed that sin was, or the curse of God's disfavor was something that could be, added together. I'm sorry. So at first, the idea was that Jewish men didn't actually menstruate, that they had hemorrhoids, and that these horrible hemorrhoids would bleed on Good Friday. And you can actually see why there would be this sort of shift between the idea of bleeding from their hinder parts, from hemorrhoids on their backsides, to, menstruation. Because I don't know how to, the same phrase was used in Latin. And this phrase in English, its derivative is the bloody flux, for 3 separate things: menstruation, dysentery, and hemorrhoids. So either you're menstruating, you're shitting blood, or you have hemorrhoids. Either way, it's going to be referred to with the same term. And, you can see how there would be a linguistic slippage. But initially, the belief was that hemorrhoids served the same purpose as menstruating. Women's bodies were colder and more phlegmatic, and they were therefore not able to digest their blood properly, and so some of it would have to flow out of them instead of, and this is the medical explanation as opposed to the theological one, as opposed to having it digest properly the way a hotter man would, because men were, perfect. But some men were too melancholic or phlegmatic and had some kind of problem with their body being too cold, and they too would have hemorrhoids, and these hemorrhoids would get rid of the blood for them. And then Jewish men were said by these same medical sources to be all melancholic. And the proof of this is that they tended to be anxious and a bit timid and not, as warlike. And basically all of the things that Christian society and Christian culture forced on Jewish men through deep-seated antisemitism and through the fact that Jewish men had a lot less power in society than Christian men and were under a lot of threat. These were all seen as ways in which they were melancholic, that this was seen as something that was an inherent part of them and not something that was because of the way they were treated by Christian society. And through this description of Jewish men as melancholic, there was a very deliberate feminization of Jewish men. They were cold like women. Their bodies were cold. They were timid and unwarlike like women. They purged blood from their bodies instead of digesting it properly like women. And in theological terms, they were cursed by God like women. Now, this feminization of Jewish men can't be seen in a vacuum from beliefs about women's impurity and cursed nature in Christianity. This was obviously the kind of thing that would make logical sense if you were already a misogynistic society. But the Jewish response to it was also very indicative of a society that had issues with deep-seated misogyny. Because as there is a rise in this belief among the Christian intelligentsia, we don't have a lot of evidence of it being something that the peasantry believed, but as it became more common among the Christian intelligentsia, the Jewish intelligentsia, at least as far as the very, very early 1700s, very early, not 1700s, 1600s, 17th century, were very well aware that this is something that Christians thought happened. And you can see a corresponding rise in the idea that Jewish women's menstrual purity was important. And specifically that Jewish women's menstrual purity, in contrast to Christian women's lack of menstrual purity, was a big thing. Because Jewish women went to the mikveh after they were finished menstruating. They performed certain cleansing rituals and engaged in practices that made themselves clean again after their cycle. And didn't sleep with their husbands while they were in the period of uncleanness. And they practiced, rituals associated with keeping their menstrual impurity contained and to wash it away before they re-entered sort of typical Jewish life. Christian women did not do that. Christian women did not have these kinds of purity practices associated around menstruation. And so Jewish men born of Jewish women and who slept with Jewish women, who slept with Jewish wives, they were maintaining that kind of menstrual purity for themselves. Christian men who slept with Christian women and who were birthed by a Christian mother, they're tainted by that Christian menstrual impurity, that menstrual impurity that Jewish women are so careful to keep themselves from having, right? Christian women are not doing the same thing, so therefore their menfolk are tainted with menstruation. This is, as best as I can, articulate it, a sort of scholastic know you. We're not the menstrually impure ones. We don't menstruate. We're not menstrually impure. You Christians, you're menstrually impure. And our status as Jewish men who are ritually pure relies on our women doing their part to be, to contain this feminine taint. We are relying basically on women to maintain our religious honor. So you have the Christian male misogyny, that causes this particular accusation to be a potent one that they can hurl at the Jewish community. But you also have Jewish misogyny and fears of women's bodies and concept of menstruation as deeply, deeply polluting in their response. So it's not like you can say that Jewish men were somehow we're just reacting as a persecuted people. They actually sort of said, okay, well, as persecuted people, we're going to shove down an even more persecuted member of our own group, women. So you can see in that how you can get a sort of we rely on this persecuted, this other class within our own group who are even more oppressed than we are, to maintain our status in the middle there. So we still have somebody beneath us. We still have women beneath us. And we're, the Christians say that we're like women. Well, no, we're not. And the women are still below us. So this is something that as a Jewish woman in the modern day, I kind of look at and go, yeah, there's some complicated stuff going on there. But you also have a lot of stuff going on here in the Christian psyche. Because, yeah, there is an effect that this had on the Jewish community, but it's also really fascinating how this idea about Jewish physical difference evolved. So, like, at first, the idea that Jews killed a Christian child for its blood to relieve male menstruation and female horrible childbirth was seen as a sort of, oh, those silly Jews, they don't know that they don't need the blood of a Christian child. They need the blood of Christ. The blood of the Christian child won't do it. They need baptism. And then that will wash away the menstruation and the double pains of childbirth, and they will, the women will have that one curse now instead of the two curses. And honestly, it's horribly unfair that, Jesus didn't do anything about the curse of women, the curse of Eve. I thought he was supposed to wipe away all sin. Dang it, Jesus. So, but apparently he supposedly was going to take away the pain of menstruation and childbirth when he came back for his second coming, according to the medieval Catholic mind. So I guess he was going to get to it eventually. So as this idea of Jewish physical difference evolved, and as it became justified by the Christian medical science of the day with the idea of Jewish men as melancholic and humorally different, there became this idea that Jews' physical difference couldn't be washed away with baptism. This is where you start really getting into the early modern ideas. Supposedly, Jewish people also had a distinctive smell. The, I can't remember, is it Feter Eutychus? Something, but it means fetid Jewish odor. I'm probably getting the Latin wrong there, but it means Jewish odor. If it's not that, I will put it in the description. And this Jewish odor could not be washed away with baptism. And the idea of Jewish people having horns like the devil, that became ingrained in the early modern mind. And that couldn't be washed away with baptism. You started having these ideas of Jewish physical difference, that they were somehow inherently different, physically less human than Christians. And this actually really sort of took off with the Reformation, not necessarily because Protestants were worse on this, but because you started having a split in the Christian community. And there was this idea that, if a Baptist, if a baptized Lutheran, returned to the Catholic fold, they had committed heresy, sure, but they were fully part of the Christian community. Jews are something else. They're not quite the same. And you can see this in England with Catholics. Catholics are English people who were just wrong on religion, but they could totally be baptized as a Protestant and they'd be fine. They'd have to, their life status would, go on as if they had never been Catholic. But Jews were somehow different. And the reason for this is the Reconquista and the Spanish Inquisition and the semi-forced conversions of a lot of Jews and Muslims to Christianity. Now, both the Jews and the Muslims who had been semi-forced to convert and who often were not particularly sincere practiced their own religions in secret. But as time wore on, the Muslims who had been mostly the peasantry and not particularly educated in their own faith started becoming more and more typical as Christians. Whereas the Jews, who tended to have been wealthier, did not. they were wealthier for a number of reasons. The poorer ones tended to were the ones who were willing to drop their property and leave, whereas the wealthier Jews were more likely to go, I'll pretend to be Christian, I'll keep my stuff. Whereas most Muslims didn't really go, unless they were very high ranking. They stayed put and just became the peasantry. They were peasantry as opposed to, there was some social difference there. But these, maybe I'll edit this out, maybe I won't, who knows? But these Jewish people who remained in Spain after the Reconquista, who were of Jewish descent, these new Christians, conversos, who were of Jewish descent, fell under the purview of the Inquisition. The Inquisition actually, it's a misunderstanding that they handled Jews. They didn't handle Jews. The Jews were either forced to leave or convert. But once they converted, they came under the Inquisition, because the Inquisition was trying to root out heresy. And one of the heresies they were trying to root out, in fact, the main heresy they were trying to root out in Spain, was the heresy of Judaizing. Judaizing is the heresy of maintaining Jewish practice and Jewish belief as a Christian, as a baptized Christian. And they began to observe that former Jews and people of Jewish descent were especially prone to Judaizing, to this particular heresy. And they started to build ideas that perhaps Jewishness and a Jewish taint couldn't fully be wiped away with baptism, that there might be something there that was in the blood. It wasn't something that, might be there because Jewish people who had been semi-forcibly converted to Christianity might not be the most sincere Christians to start with, or if they were sincere Christians, that they might have maintained a couple of cultural practices as one does. No, instead it was because they had Jewish blood, which made them vulnerable to the heresy of Judaizing, because the blood was itself somehow tainted. And so you come back to the idea of there being something physically different about Jews in the blood. And this is where we come back to the idea of Jewish male menstruation, the Jewish odor, and the Jewish horns, all of which were things that made Jews a little bit less human, a little bit less like Christians. These physical differences, which also began to be seen as associated with the physical differences that you get from a population that has, certain ethnic traits. Though incidentally, those traits tend to be like Mediterranean traits. So like, how are you going to tell Jews different from Italians? I don't know. But like the nose and the shape of the eyes and the dark curly hair that many Jews have, and the pallid complexion was one that came up a lot. Pallid and both pallid or olive complexion with yellow undertones, basically, these were all seen as stereotypical Jewish features. And so there came to be this idea of Jews being very physically different from Christians. And this began really in the early modern period. And I think that we can all see in this how that fed into the idea of Jewish people as a separate race and as an inferior race. And it was from the sort of intellectual categorization of Jewish people as a different and inferior race that you start to see the Christians and European Gentiles patterning racism in the colonial sense on this pre-existing intellectual framework that they had built for themselves to justify their distaste for and persecution of the Jews. Side note, I wore this short sleeve menstrually colored t-shirt today just for this video. It is much, much, much too cold to be wearing a t-shirt today, but the things I do for this video. Oh, and I should do some kind of spiel about how this is appropriate for writers. Yes, spiel for writers. Well, so I have this whole speech that I had about how racism and bigotry is batshit and always is batshit and is always crazy and is always nonsensical and has no logic. And that is true. Sometimes it has an internal logic, like how we can get from Eve was cursed by God and the Jews were cursed by God, so therefore they have the same curse. Not sure how that follows. Sometimes there is internal logic, but there is never external logic, right? But that's not strictly true. What you find is that there is a logic of we need to believe something about this people that makes it okay to persecute them because we are making use of this persecution in some way. Either it is useful for our culture to have a group to shove down, see Jewish men and, maintaining menstrual purity, or it is, we are taking their stuff, which they definitely were doing with Jews. Pogroms tended to involve a lot of stealing Jewish people's stuff and frequently canceling the debts of the local nobility who owed money to Jewish moneylenders. There were financial rewards for being an anti-Semitic shithead. But also, keeping Jews in their place served an economic purpose. And you can see this with, modern racism. It serves an economic and social purpose to maintain ideas of racial hierarchy for the dominant class. So trying to find a justification for those beliefs in fiction, you should maybe stick to how that is useful for the class that is dominant and maybe have them have some kind of internal logic for why they believe this. But don't have that logic have any basis in the real world. Don't have a situation where somehow this race betrayed the other race, or this species even betrayed this other race, and that's why they're persecuted today 1,000 years later. Incidentally, I hope I'm not the only one who hears in that, just a little bit of Christian charges of deicide. We do this to the Jews because they killed Jesus. That seems like that might be an inspiration for that, but it's always held up as something that is actually true in universe. Don't do that. Have your bigotry be something that does not actually make sense based on the group that is held as the bad group, as something that they actually did. Don't do that. Racial allegories where one group is totally to blame for being the victims of racism are bad. And just so you know, you can make your reasoning for why persecuted group is persecuted in the minds of the persecuting group as batshit as you want, because ultimately it's not going to be more batshit than the idea that Jewish cis men menstruate. They, as ever, the real world is weirder than anything you can possibly come up with. And also, that is all for now. So, I'm Anna Fisher. This is my YouTube channel. If you sat through this YouTube channel so far, I am deeply impressed. If you are a cis man, I am even more deeply impressed because of our cultural gross associations with menstruation. I'm proud of you. I think it's highly unlikely you're here because according to YouTube's analytics, no men watch my channel. Not a lot of women do either. It's a small channel. But anyway, if you've made it so far and you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please consider liking and subscribing and possibly leaving me a comment, because this is a tiny YouTube channel, and it's days like this that I am actually kind of glad that I have never been monetized, that I don't have enough of a channel to actually be monetized, because this video would definitely have been demonetized. And so anyway, social media links in the description below. Follow me on Tumblr or Instagram. Instagram is mostly pictures of my dogs and flowers. No menstruation. And I hope you had a lovely day so far. I hope this video didn't make it completely horrible. If it hasn't been lovely so far, I hope it gets better soon. And bye for now. I hope to see you in the next video, which will be, next week. Anyway, bye for now.